Dr. Derek Black, professor at the University of South Carolina, professor, expert, author of a couple books, right? So Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy, as well as your upcoming book to be published in January 2025, January 14th, Dangerous Learning, The South's Long War on Black Literacy. I'm so thankful and excited to have you here on Living Corporate. How are you doing?
I'm doing as well as I can be. Get up every day, put a smile on, and keep doing your job.
I'm thinking about when we connected. We connected a couple years ago, and we were supposed to really actually coordinate and have you on the show back then. I don't know, something happened between pandemic. I had another kid. Who's to say? But I'm really glad that we're here in this moment now. First of all, I think I want to start just by getting some context on why this space for you, right? Like why education law and policy, educational equality and school funding for disadvantaged students. Like where did that specialization or that interest come from?
Yeah, I mean, in my first book, in Schoolhouse Burning, I talk about it from two perspectives. One is that public education really is the intergenerational inheritance that kids like myself, it's the only intergenerational inheritance they could hope to expect, right? That, a lot of kids out there, it is the public schools that make the difference for them. I went through, I don't know, when I was writing the book, I counted it up and now I've forgotten again, but I went through like 7 schools or 7 different houses, in 8 or 9 years. And it really was the public schools and the public teachers who were sort of bedrock for me. And as I say, kind of wanted more for me than I wanted for myself sometimes. So that was certainly important for me, sort of realizing how much this institution has made a difference for me. And that the people who made the decision, right, that I was going to have this education, that sort of put it in, the Tennessee State Constitution, the North Carolina Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution, on and on and on. People they did this like 150 years ago, right? Because they believe that this is what a democracy would be built on. The other part of it, which I think is a little bit, more unique to me, is I'm a graduate of Clinton High School. Clinton High School, before I got there, but Clinton High School is the first traditionally white high school in the South to graduate an African American. So that's where Thurgood Marshall went after Brown versus Board of Education. There were 8 black high school kids going to school about 200 yards up the hill. And he said, let them walk off the hill. That's all we want. Just let them walk off the hill. They walked off that hill. They went to school. And actually, surprisingly, I guess in some people's minds, it went pretty well as far as things could be expected. But after they'd been going to school there for close to a year, some folks from outside the state and some Ku Klux Klan types kind of heard that something radical was going on in Little Clinton, Tennessee, and they came and violence got out of control and the school was bombed. And, that bombing of the school harmed black students and white students. It bombed everyone's school. And so it changed that community. And I think I'm part of that legacy. I feel grateful to have gone to the first traditionally white high school to graduate an African American. I learned a lot from that experience. I reflect on my own life. But I think what maybe, either makes me naive or different than a lot of other people is that I don't see the public education project as being one in which Black people and white people and Latino students and others are pitted against one another, like crabs in a barrel or part of a zero-sum game. I see it again as this intergenerational gift that we all have a vested interest in protecting and defending that serves us all. So again, maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm Pollyannish, but that's kind of how I see it. And I've seen that as reality in my own life. And I want that to be an opportunity that other kids still get to partake in.
And simultaneously interesting is that you count yourself amongst a legacy of people, right? You like the fact that you think about your part of your journey and you call out Thurgood Marshall, like as a white man, and I recognize your last name I recognize you, Dr. Black, but as a white man in this space, like what is it that has you because I don't even know how else to say this, just but like just very frankly, right? Like, and your accent reminds me of that movie when I think it was Matthew McConaughey in it, from A Time to Kill. And it was the closing argument, and basically Matthew McConaughey's argument was basically like, look, I know
Right.
you don't care because this is a little black girl, but pretend to have a conscience. But I know I will activate your conscience if we pretend this happened to a white girl. And so I'm just gonna ask very directly and bluntly, like, why care, right? Like, I would imagine there's plenty of people
Yeah.
with your, I know rather, confident rather, that there's plenty of people with your profile, certainly your educational bona fides and your and your the success that you've had. Like, if, I'm confident that there aren't 100,000 Dr. Blacks. So what is it for you that made you say, you know what, I'm actually going to activate and care about this for all kids, and I'm going to see myself as a part of this human experience and not segregate myself?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I don't think anyone has ever asked it of me in that way, and so you get a unique answer, I guess, today. I mean, I think I my off the cuff response is twofold, which is, one is an obvious one, which is, I went to school. I mean, look, it was still a majority white school, but I went to a school and I had black friends and black kids, and we were all part of the same project, right? So that's number one, right? That's what they were saying a long time ago in desegregation, was that intergroup contact matters, and it does. Number two is, I think, I hate to sort of psychoanalyze myself on a podcast, but I do think that although I clearly do not have the experience of black children as my personal experience, I do have the experience of not being part of the in crowd, right? That and moving from school to school, trying to fit in, trying to sort of make a way for yourself, right? That I had a little bit of a personal identification as an outsider. That's number two. Now, I did not, however, experience, racial discrimination or things that black children have experienced. But what I can tell you is that, I can't believe I'm saying this to you today, but I felt like the black kids accepted me for who I was. Right. I had that feeling. Now, maybe that was just projection on my part, and that's not to say that like all my best friends they weren't, right. But I felt as home, amongst my black friends as I did amongst my white friends. And far more of my friends were white than black, but I didn't have this sort of feeling of division. So that's, I guess, number two or three. And then the final step is, having been a graduate of Clinton High School, meant that I saw the reel-to-reel footage, black and white footage in those old days that's the way we watched movies when I was a kid, watching what happened to my community and just being stamped by it. Kendi has his book Stamped, and he means something. Like, I was stamped by that video, right? Watching people on the screen whose families' names I knew acting like fools, right? Watching, and maybe sort of later knowing the family names of kids who suffered, right, who were part of my generation, right? So that history, right, was there for me because I was stamped by that video. The story's not done yet, though, right? I'm a young, like, this sounds like, black, he's got something going on in his mind. No, he's just a immature kid like everyone else, trying to sort of figure it out. He doesn't know all this stuff when he's 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Doesn't know it when he's 19 or 20. But, around the time of 21, 22, I take a class. There's this guy teaching a class. I was taking Indian religion or something like that. It was religious studies class. And there was this African-American professor. I never had an African-American teacher in my life. There's an African-American professor who was exiting that classroom every day as I was entering. And, he always had a smile on his face, and sometimes he said hi to me. Like, he clearly recognized me from the fact we were just passing. He was kind of nice. And like any young, immature student, I said, I'm going to take that guy's class. He seems like a nice guy. And so I took his class, and it was a class, and I don't know what we called it, but it was African American study, or what he called it. It was African American studies class. And we read a lot of interesting books, one of which was by Derek Bell, who would be rolling over in his grave now if he thought that everyone, knew his name at this point in history and what critical race theory was. But we read that, we read a lot of things. And, that class began to help me understand the road that I had traveled as a young man. And so it kind of just made sense of my own life. And I think when we begin to understand ourselves as humans, as you said, understand our place as humans in relationship to those who came before us, it just opens us up to an entirely different perspective. And so, how does one get there? I think part of that, the little part that I'll give a little bit of credit to myself, is just being willing to listen. Being willing to listen and learn. And, having gone through two institutions, one Clinton High School and one, University of Tennessee with African American Studies program, that was willing to listen and learn. And unfortunately, people on many sides of the political spectrum were not willing to do either of those two things anymore. And I think that's really hurting our schools. I think that's really hurting our country.
Speaking of books, I read a book some years ago, and it was probably the most depressing book I've ever read. It's called When Affirmative Action Was White. And it was depressing, and like Things Fall Apart was sad. And I've read other books that were sad. I think what was depressing about when Affirmative Action Was White is just how black and white, no pun intended, the disparate impact was, or rather the very intentional impacts of segregation were, and how massively underfunded and undersupported black schools were. And then rolling in and introducing the GI Bill within the context of a racist state government, and how that exasperated difference and funding and support. And then it became depressing again for me, because I thought about how that has continued further, right? Like the idea of inequitable funding and support for black and brown schools, and black and institutions or areas where the student population or just is majority black and brown, or even significantly black and brown, really has been a continual thing, right? This is not like a new, phenomena over the past 15, 20 years. It's not like this current administration is going to inventing inequality. I'm curious, to hear your perspective on the historicity of inequitable experiences, educational experiences, and the implications of this administration, and what parents and those who just care, to the point about human experience, need to be mindful of and need to be fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, I think your question triggers me to think about this article I wrote a couple of years ago, research paper about, I think it's called Localism, something, something, and the Color of School Dollars. Something's not the actual word, but anyway. So the point that I make in that article is that localism is a bit, and education it's got some half truths and it's got some truths. But it's like, how do we get to the place we are where sort of local education and localism is such a big concept? Well, if we rewind back to the beginning, I'll say this, which is public education would not have gotten off the ground as a system that serves all if left to local communities. In fact, what I point out in this paper is that in the 1800s in particular, it's the states. The states are pushing hard. They're throwing out money, sort of begging these communities to open schools and making all sorts of guarantees, because they understand that a state democracy rests on education, and they need to bring this opportunity to everyone. They also understand that some communities lack the capacity to do that for themselves. So, from very early on, they're doing that. But there's this other thing that happens in the early 1800s is fascinating. If you think about state and local government, it doesn't really need much money except for schools, right? You need a police department. Back then they didn't have a fire department. You need a police department, a couple of sheriffs, deputies. It's not that big of a financial undertaking. So local taxes, you get roads and bridges, but local taxes are sort of significant state and local taxes really are necessitated by public education. Even today, you look at what's the biggest share of state and local taxes, public education. So there's one thing that's been true throughout history, and I think all listeners will appreciate, which is, urban, suburban, rural, black, white, rich, poor, nobody likes taxes. Nobody wants to pay taxes. That is human nature, right? Like, less I pay, the better, right? If I owe it, I'll pay it, but don't ask me to this is not trying to waste money. And so, back in the 1800s, they're like, we're going to start asking people to pay taxes. Like, what's the best way to do that? People aren't going to like it one way or the other. But if what we're telling them is to, send their shekels into, Atlanta or, Richmond or wherever, like, they are not having that, right? They're going to be even more mad. They're sending their money to some guy they don't see or know. So maybe the better thing to do would be to collect those taxes locally. We'll have the local dudes, at least somebody right? You're less likely to shoot that guy. But guess what? Actually, some people were on their front porches with guns saying, we're not paying taxes. We don't care whether it's for schools or otherwise. So there's this initial tax problem, which is, how do you just get people used to paying them? They thought local would be better than state, but the states were still sort of underwriting and sort of incentivizing that. Just it's almost like a shell game, right? Let's just sort of trick them into getting into it. So that's the localism part of it, and that really develops, in the North and out West. Now in the South, we didn't have this tax problem because in the South, prior to the Civil War, we didn't really have public schools, and so after the Civil War, primarily as a result of the freedmen, we established these public education systems throughout the South. And that system of financing initially is centralized through the state, that all the money that's being raised, which, by the way, was by poll taxes, right? The black freedmen said, you know what, we may not want to spend money on other things, but we will spend it on public education, and we think the poll is the most equitable place to do it. So, black legislators got behind poll taxes. All that money went to the state house. It got distributed back out based upon need. So we had this early in the South system that was different than the North. But then what happened was, when Reconstruction fell and the Redeemers took over state government, they saw a problem, which is, well, even though Jim Crow let a lot of things fly, there were courts out there that were saying, you can't collect black taxes and white taxes and keep them in a different piggy bank in the state treasury. Like, that's one thing that won't fly. So what the states then did was began to push power for financing and responsibility back out to the local districts so that they could do whatever they wanted to. And they had this sort of phrase in some of the statutes that said they could distribute funds as they deemed just or fair or something like that. And in 1880 South Carolina, that meant more for white kids and less for black kids. And so you saw this disparity happening through the local power. And so, we have this sort of localism that's part about not wanting to pay taxes in the North, and localism in the South, which is about trying to maintain segregation. Like, probably no one on this, listen to this, knows any of this history. You sort of fast forward to the 70s, and the Supreme Court goes, localism is one of the most important, values in public education. And so we're not going to disturb it for desegregating schools across district lines, and we're not going to disturb it for fair school funding either. And people just kind of go, yeah, well, some people, yeah, that's right, localism. And so, but it's not the most important value in public education. It ends up being this happenstance thing that comes into place to solve two problems: anti-tax concerns and racism. Well, it doesn't solve racism, it facilitates it. So, and so we still have these remnants. Now, I'm not saying the way that we fund schools today in South Carolina is the model of what we were doing in 1880 or what have you. But, we do have this sort of legacy that flows from this that makes us think as a society that the way we're doing it is normal. This is normal. This is the way it's supposed to be. This is the way it's always been. It's like, well, it's not normal or abnormal. It's just a thing that we randomly did for reasons that really weren't all that compelling, to be quite honest.
So then, as we think about like today, like there's a lot of conversation around school choice. We have our, this incoming administration talking about they want to essentially defund like the Department of Education. They want to kind of leave education back to the states. There's also commentary around the idea that this is a way to sidestep Brown versus Board of Education. I'm curious, like, your perspective on the current state of education and education equality and access for all. And then, because then I want to talk a little bit about from a parent's perspective, like what are the practical things you think we should be thinking about, right? In terms of just what does all this practically and tangibly mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much going on in this space of the Department of Education right now, and a lot of it is noise. I say, look, there's policies, and then there's things that you say, right? And the president-elect says lots of things, and those things push emotional buttons. But, policy is a whole different ball of wax. And, the department is comprised of lots of stuff that a lot of people like. As I tell folks, when during the Obama administration, when Congress and the president couldn't agree on the time of day, couldn't agree on keeping the lights on at the federal government and just sort of saying, hey, let's pay the national debt, couldn't agree on putting some money into the system to help us out in global crisis. We couldn't agree on any of those things. But guess what? In the last month of the Obama administration, 80% of the people in the House voted for the Every Student Succeeds Act, and 85% voted for it in the Senate, right? So, and they did that because they love Obama? No, they did it because there's a constituency that sees the value in this Department of Education, right? I mean, the quote unquote red states depend on this money more than the blue states. Massachusetts can walk away from Title I tomorrow if it wants to. It's got the resources. So can New York, right? California's kind of cheap, but push come to shove, they could do it too. Mississippi cannot walk away from Title I. Right? Alabama cannot walk away from Title I, at least, not and provide basic services. So, you start cutting out free lunches, you start, making classrooms larger, you start doing away with, teacher supports, you start doing away with special services for students with disabilities. You start doing away with the money that you fund, ELL supports on, and like people are going to lose their mind, right? I mean, these are basic things that, tens of millions of American families count on every day. Now, it's not all due to the federal government, but those things I just named are funds that come exclusively from the federal government. So, so that's number one. Like there's actually a lot of vested interest in the Department of Education that people don't realize. All they know, or all some of the voters know, is like, yeah, they seem to have done some stuff around, COVID or maybe CRT that I don't like, although they didn't do anything on that, but they think that they have, right? Or we can't teach what we want to here in Oklahoma because, the Secretary of Education will let. None of that is true. Actually, there is one of the shortest provisions in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of all the rules. One of the most shorted ones. It says the department shall exercise no control over the curriculum. Right? It's there. Right? It's just crystal clear. And, with these state plans that have to be submitted every year to the department, which are burdensome, for state officials, had to be submitted every year. But guess what the statute says? It says that the secretary has no authority to review or request any changes in regard to the curriculum. In fact, because of some flack that happened, when Arne Duncan was Secretary of Education, it said they don't even have to submit their academic standards to the department. All they got to do is submit a letter that says, we hereby certify that we have high quality academic standards, right? So, there's this boogeyman idea about what the department is doing or not doing. And I'm not going to sit here and say, hey, they don't do anything. Like when somebody from the U.S. Department of Education calls you and you're a school official, like, chills run up your spine. You're like, yes, sir. What can I do to help you today? But, in terms of like this big bad guy who's running all this stuff, that's not true. I think a lot of what's happening right now is that the federal government is being blamed for the state's own shortcoming. They can teach whatever they want to. They can spend as much money as they want to, or as little as they want. All these things, states do it. And now they want to blame, the federal government for their problems. I wrote an article in 2017 that's called, literally, Abandoning the Federal Role in Public Education, semicolon, the Every Student Succeeds Act. Right? Because that act stripped a lot of power away from the department. So, a lot of this in my mind is just, it's posturing. With all that said, I do fully expect that, President-elect Trump will appoint a chaos agent, to lead the department. And, that person is going to have a lot of influence on which districts are called and which ones aren't, and what they're given a hard time about and what they haven't. And so, the first part of my comments suggest, hey, everybody calm down. Yeah, the second part say, wait a minute, like, there may be a troublemaker coming to run that department, but right. That's different than ending the department.
That's different than fundamentally changing a bunch of or removing a bunch of policy.
That's right. And on that point, there's such a level of complexity that would bore people to hear. So I'm not going to say it. I'll just say there's such a level of complexity involved in Title I, Title II, Title IV, Title IX, that to go in and seriously make changes to that, to begin to unravel the department, would take at least 2 or 3 years, and there'll be some other shiny thing, catching our attention.
Like to that point, right? Sure. Like I was talking to my wife about this, is part of, when you think about we think about federal government, frankly, any level of government, but certainly federal government. I think about it like an old company. So like if you come into an old company, and let's say you want to be like, let's just say you come into like, let's say JP Morgan Chase, and you say, hey, I'm the new head of HR, and every Tuesday I want us to have Taco Tuesdays. Okay, this is JP Morgan Chase. So you're going to have to do, there's a bunch of stuff you got to do. As simple or whatever you think that is, there's a bunch of red tape and process you're going to need to follow and things you're going to need to check off before you have Taco Tuesdays every day for all the employees at JP Morgan Chase. A ton of questions and people you got to clear that off with between your local branches and the corporate office, and coordinating between managers and supervisors, and accounting for time away and budget, and allocating that budget for tacos, and who the vendor is going to be, and validating that person. And so I think about the same thing for like the government. Very silly and simplistic example, but I think about the government of like, to your point about the Department of Education, it's like, hey, like you can have somebody in there, but first of all, they have to be extremely competent and understanding the structures of that institution to even unravel anything. And then as they're actually unraveling things, it's still going to take time. I think like a chaos agent that's going to create a lot of noise and distraction. But I remember, who was it? It might've been Lauren Boebert. She was trying to talk about something on the Hill and was saying like, you rolled this back. And like the guy was like, no, that's not true at all. Like, that's not how this works. And so it's like, there has to be a degree of competence in addition to like expertise and time to make, to your point, make substantive policy changes. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I mean, to your point, I mean, first of all, I love your analogy. I think that's, people don't have to go to law school to understand that, right? That makes sense, right? Taco Tuesday is not as simple as one would think. So, but yeah, I think there's also just this sort of inherent tension in what the new administration is saying, which is, they want to go out there and, root out DEI programs and wokeism and this, that, and another. Well, guess what? Like, if you're not giving money out to these schools, you don't have any authority to tell them to do anything, right? And if you don't have any employees in the Office for Civil Rights, then you don't have anybody to go out there and claim that they're discriminating against white students, right? So, like, to do the things that they want to do, they need some of this apparatus to stay in place. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle that I think people are starting to catch on to. And then there's also, I think this goes back to your Taco Tuesday example and how complicated it is. I mean, Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education in the prior administration, she came in and she was a change agent, and she started demanding this policy and that policy. And a number of those actually got reversed because there's this little thing called the Administrative Procedures Act that sort of governs all the rules by which you change an old policy to a new one. And they're like, you skipped 10 steps, right? You can't do that. So some of that stuff got rewound that she tried to change. And, she spent 4 years in office, and as much fodder as she gave me for writing op-eds and books and this, that, and she didn't really accomplish anything in those 4 years. And I'm not trying to be a smart aleck. Like, she really doesn't have a signature achievement. For you sort of corporate listeners, there's only one thing actually that she achieved in 4 years, and it's relatively minor in the grand scope of things. For those of you who have 527 savings accounts out there for your children's college, that money used to always be reserved exclusively for college. She managed to convince them to make a change in the tax code and that big tax bill that the Trump tax bill that changed to allow you to spend money out of your 527s on K through 12 education as well. So, important for families out there that are paying out of pocket for K through 12 education. Other than that, that's not much. I think the next person is going to be far more chaotic.
There's a lot of things happening. So I live in Texas. Obviously, we have Governor Greg Abbott. This is not a political podcast, ironically, believe it or not, Dr. Black. So I'm going to reserve my comments about Mr. Abbott, Governor Abbott. But curious, like, I know that you've written about school choice. You've written about Texas. I think there are a lot of states out there. There are some states out there. I think about Florida and Texas specifically. But I also think about Oklahoma, that I believe for the common person who's just kind of like aware, they almost kind of seem like testing grounds for what it seems as if the Republican Party wants to really enact around the nation. Talk to me a little bit about school choice and what that really, like, this concept of school choice and what that really means for like the average parent.
Yeah. So, well, let me take a little prerogative first, because I can't help but say that, like, the Republican Party and the Republican voter are actually in two different places on this issue. You see, first of all, the Republican House and the Republican Senate is the one who has refused for the last 5 years to pass a voucher bill in Texas. It's been the governor's office and the governor's office only that's been insisting. Governor held them over for 4 special sessions this past year saying, I want it. And they said, we don't care. You ain't getting it. Then he went and primaried those rural Republicans who were holdouts and got different people in there. And you might go, okay, well, that's democracy at work. That's what the people want. But it's not what the people want. How do I know that? Because on election night, November this year, when Republicans are sweeping, the House, the Senate, local races, governors, on down the road, there's this one little data point on the 3 voucher bills that were put to the voters. One was in Kentucky, which voted for Donald Trump at a higher rate than did Texas. All right. And guess what? The voters, I think it was like 59% of them voted against vouchers in Kentucky. Then in Nebraska, which also voted for Donald Trump at a higher rate than Texas, I think it was like 64%, I think. Or maybe it was Kentucky that was 64%. But 64% of voters vote for Trump, and 65% vote against the voucher bill. So, even Republican voters are not keen on this idea. So what we really have is that party leadership and outside third-party interests have captured the state house, right? And have sold this idea to governors and presidents, and they're running with it, but the people aren't buying it. I mean, that's so there's a democratic process problem going on there. But you didn't ask for democratic process. You asked, what does this mean for regular families? What I always start with, and I think Texas actually proved this to me 5 years ago, when small rural districts, got on buses, leaders and families and parents, and descended on Austin and said, we do not want vouchers, even though you snuck it through the Senate, and then it failed 103 to 44 in the House because those rural communities came out. And so I said, you know what? I think we have this conversation about vouchers, and what it really does is completely ignore the everyday needs and lives of so many of our kids in a way that's extremely insulting, right? If you're from I don't know, I like to run around in Texas a little bit, not trying to turn this into Texas podcast, but I went to Big Bend National Park with my family, and there are places that are so remote, and I'm surprised they're even able to run a school because the population is so remote. And, those communities see folks in Austin, going back and forth about vouchers and private schools. And they're sitting out there waving their arms saying, what about me? What about my community with, buses with tires that are about to blow out? What about me with a bus that hadn't been replaced in 20 years? What about me with a facility that doesn't have, adequate heating and air in it? What about me? And you guys are up there parading around talking about choice and equality and trying to use, to be quite honest, young black children as your posters for why this needs to be done, and you're not speaking to our needs, and that's insulting. So I tell them, I said, look, you hear something that you're a rural community, you hear something about vouchers, you should call your representative and say, when's the last time a new brick was built in my school district? When's the last time a new bus was bought in my district? When's the last time we had a fully staffed classroom? And if the answer is not recently, then you should be mad as a hornet, and you should be telling them to vote no on vouchers, right? So that there's this conversation that doesn't speak to regular folks. Now, we move into our sort of more suburban and urban settings. What do these vouchers mean? I mean, for me, what I worry the most, what keeps me up at night, is the idea that public schools have always been the singular place where we at least were willing to come together. Now, we got a lot of segregated schools, but if you're in the district, we're all takers. We come together. We try to find what unites us, not what divides us. But if what we start doing is replacing them with ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic silos, and there no longer is a place in America where we come together to try to find a common good, I mean, that's when I would say God help us, right? That's the place that sort of worries me. And, we look at just a report just came out from ProPublica looking at the state of North Carolina and their voucher program. And what they pointed out is that there are 20 white segregation academies that were formed during desegregation, to avoid desegregation, that are still operating in North Carolina today. And they, on average, draw $1 million a year in vouchers. And that's a problem. This is the silo problem that I'm talking about. These sort of former, and now I'm sure maybe there's some diversity there, but these schools on average are 83% white, right? When our schools in North Carolina are majority students of color, so huge gap there, and they're drawing $1 million a year in public funding. And the other thing in that day, or maybe I missed on that 83% thing. Actually, it's that. Only 17% of the recipients, I guess it's still the same number, only 17% of the recipients of vouchers in the state of North Carolina, looking at all the schools, not just the segregation academy, of all the schools, wow. Only 17% of them are students of color. Right. So, I mean, to me, this is not an issue where we should talk about freedom. That's not what's going on here, right? I mean, if we're talking about freedom, we're talking about the freedom to separate, which I don't think is a good sort of. It's your right to separate. To be clear, constitutional law. It is your right. You don't like the public schools. You want to leave. You want to send your kid to an all black or all white or all Latino school like that. That's your business as a parent. But it's an entirely different ball of wax for state government to say, I'm going to collect taxes and I'm going to help people do that. We're going to be part of that. And I think that's the dangerous thing that I always want people to sort of understand. Now, someone this morning accused me of race baiting when I sort of raised this thing. Like, I'm not race baiting.
Yeah.
Right? I'm together baiting.
Yeah.
I'm baiting us to be together.
Yeah.
I'm not race baiting.
I think as I hear the things that you're outlining, I mean, first of all, it reminds me, I remember so I have 2 children, 2 small children. Neither one of them are ready for public school yet, or ready for school. They're not even pre-K age yet. And at the same time, I remember before I became a parent, I remember I was listening to some podcast or something that was like, yo, the most selfish people in the world are like parents, right? Because like they can like fall into these very like myopic frames of just thinking about their kid, and are not thinking about community, are not thinking about, to your point, working and building together. And I am concerned, right? Like that there's a percentage of parents, of adults, who would be working and looking to segregate in that way, and so nakedly, right? And then I think about this overwhelming larger population of parents who have 9-to-5 jobs, who have very demanding schedules, who might be working 2 to 3 jobs, who may be dealing with a layoff, and trying to navigate and figure out what they're trying to do. Now, faced with the prospect of, or the even like the threat of these programs and free lunches and all these different things that they depend on to survive, right? Like their public school is a part of their ecosystem and their budget, right? Like if I'm over here, if I suddenly have to come out another $300 a month to feed my kid during lunchtime, or I have to, we're adding so many dollars to our grocery bill, or, okay, hey, this school is no longer as accessible. Like, I'm not even talking about necessarily even having to put them in private school, because of course that could bankrupt the household, right? I'm just talking about like the quote unquote little things, beyond like the cost to your pocket, the time that you're not spending at work, that you're having to like further engage and be more engaged with your child at your child's school. I mean, the employee experience, like the these companies that have these employees, and having to then deal with their adjusted schedules, or having to give them additional slack and space to manage things around their household, the stress that they would induce from these things. I mean, there's just very practical implications. I think so often we look at things in like these very siloed, almost vacuumed contexts. But like Dr. Black, like there's nothing that happens to us as a society that only impacts one element of us, right? You touch this thing over here is going to break. You touch this thing over here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really enjoyable conversation for me to be having with you, because you coming at it from more of an everyday life and listener perspective, and I get caught up in my tower at times. But I want to say a few things. I mean, number one, when COVID first hit, which seems like a long time ago, there was this part of me that said, this is public school's moment. Because when those kids were home with us for, that, and let's be clear about the months, when they were home with us in March, April, and May, a lot of us were like, dang, this is hard what these teachers are doing. Kids don't just sit in their desk and read a book all day and do everything you tell them, number one. Number two, we began to realize that so much of what's important about public schools is not about reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's the experience of those schools. And kids didn't get that because they're at home, right? And I thought, not that I wish COVID on anyone, but I was like, I was like, people are really appreciating their schools now for a minute. But then what happened was that by the end of the summer, we're also human. We're like so worn out, like, oh my God, can't my kids go back? Let's go. And then you saw some people start to bait us with issues around race and gender and start to try to divide people. People who just wanted the kids to go back to school together and learn. And people said, let's use this for politics. Let's use this political advantage. So, and that's where the voucher movement actually takes off, is in the fall after. They're like, we can do this. We can wield this. We can create division, and so that's one thing. But I will say, before COVID, there was this incredible study, and I talked about it in Schoolhouse Burning. It's a study of Southern voters, and it was demographically representative. So as to say, it had more Republicans in it than Democrats. It sort of matched the electorate. And they asked them a series of questions about, adequate funding, more funding, classroom, all these things. And at that moment in time, there was no more than 2 to 5 percentage points that separated Republican from Democratic voters on all of these questions of like meeting need and funding schools more fair. Like that's what the public wanted. And so now we look at this current chaotic moment, or getting rid of the department and vouchers and all this, sort of say like, look, what elected officials have done is manage to push aside these basic things that voters wanted, Republican and Democrat wanted at 70, 80, 85%, and instead replaced them with these very divisive, narrow, razor's edge issues of, vouchers and this, that, and another. Well, actually, I wouldn't say they're razor edge. Most people oppose them, but sort of use those as tools to accumulate political power. And so our schools are being used as a weapon. I should say the issue of schools is being used against us as a weapon. And what I'll add to this, and I hate to say it, but I tell folks, look, we keep funding these vouchers, right? And we keep sending more and more, primarily middle income and white children, out of the public school system. When our public schools become the place where only poor children go, the public education project is over. It is over. We used to have, like back in 1860, we had pauper schools, Paupers. We had pauper schools. They never worked well. Their welfare, their charity, there's no sort of broad-based commitment, right? It's just like, whatever, these kids don't deserve anything anyway. Give them, they're lucky to be here, right? That's sort of the perspective. And so if that's where we're moving, then the public education project is over. Now, I hope we avoid that, because guess what? I may not be the average, upper middle income white dude, but I think there are a lot of folks like me. They may not have the same politics, but like 90% of us went to public school. And I think and they appreciate that. Not all 90%, but a lot of them appreciate it. And if they can just understand the danger that we're flirting with, I don't think they're willing to throw away their public schools. I think those results that I told you about in Nebraska, that I told you about in Kentucky, tell you these folks in ruby red states are not ready to throw away their schools, but they've got public officials that are flirting with that. And I think that's sad.
Dr. Black,
that's dangerous.
Before we let you go, I got to give you space to plug. I know we talked about at the top of the interview, but to plug your book, where people can find it, where people can pre-order, I give you the floor.
Yeah, and I'll be quick on this. I am so excited about Dangerous Learning, the South's long war on Black literacy. It comes out of a chapter, half a chapter that I wrote in Schoolhouse Burning that didn't really fit the narrative, and it really starts with the story of Black people in the middle of the Civil War who finally got the chance to go to school, and how much it meant to them. And the stories, and there's a few of them are littered in Schoolhouse Burning, but it just looked like stuff written for a Hollywood script. I mean, just, there's this one story of a 80 some odd year old Black man standing on the banks of a little island in the middle of the Mississippi River. And this little white woman rows up in a rowboat, and she says, "Hello, my name is X. I'm here to teach." And he said, "I know. thank the Lord, I've been waiting on you for all my life, for 25 years or something like that. And it's just like, oh my God, like, is she making that up? Is that true? You know? And then you read these stories here in South Carolina of families, enslaved families that, you know, down in the Sea Islands that, you know, once the North took control in 1863, in the middle of the war, people had more freedom of movement. They start moving from island to island to try to get closer to the missionary teacher, right? That people bringing in their babies at like 2 years old saying, we got to start now. And actually in some of these schools, multi-generational, you know, newborn baby, mama, grandma, great grandma, grandpa, all together, actually in the school, to, you know, like nothing you've ever seen before, trying to learn to read because, you know, there's a history there. And so that human element motivated me to write. I was just sort of amazed by the stories. And what I wanted to write about was the secret schools that preceded that moment. So Black people had been running these secret schools for quite a long time. You know, the problem with secret schools is, you know, good secrets stay secret. So I wasn't able to write a whole book about secret schools. But what I do in this book is construct this sort of history that says, when did the criminalization of Black literacy begin? And I think it's probably news to some people know, like, hey, actually there were Black schools, including schools that were educating enslaved children out in the open, operating in Charleston in 1801, 1802, 1802. Like, what changed, right? Well, there's some slave revolts and some literate Black men that sort of changed the laws there. But there was this period when that wasn't so. So I start there. And what I do is sort of track this suspicion of Black literacy that starts in 1820 and continues throughout. We also see the sort of Black pride in literacy, which explains why they were the ones that helped create public schools in the aftermath of the Civil War. But that sort of suspicion and worry about educated Black people explains why the South decides that their war on Black people won't just be at the ballots in 1876. It's going to be at the schoolhouse too, that they understood those things were together. And then I wrap all that up. There's also some weird stuff that happens, which is they start censoring white people too during in the pre-slavery period. They didn't want white people reading certain things, and they decided that all Northern textbooks were dangerous, including my most laughable one was they one of the governors sort of held up this geography book, and he claimed that it was biased against the South because it spent more time talking about Northern crops than Southern crops. I mean, just paranoia like crazy. And at that moment I said, wait a minute, like this paranoia about our school books, that sounds really familiar to what's been going on in America over the last couple of years. And so I also sort of weave this story into thinking about, what does this, you know, this push and pull around Black literacy and, you know, radical ideas in the newspapers and textbooks, what's that all got to do with today? And I try to situate the current moment in light of that long history. So I'm really excited, published, Yale University Press, available Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, wherever you want to get it for pre-order, and it'll be out on
Dr.
January
Black,
14th.
It's been a pleasure. I look forward to us keeping lines of communication open. Hopefully the next time we DM each other, I won't wait 2 years to get you on the pod, man. Hey, y'all, make sure y'all check out the links in the show notes. Y'all pre-order this book. Y'all learn more about Dr. Black. Till next time. Peace.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Dr. Derek Black.